Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bolton of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about. Maui is one of the most beautiful places in the world, but with that beauty comes challenges. The Lahaina fires and other natural disasters, a housing crisis, a high cost of living, and difficulty recruiting and retaining essential workers. State Senator Troy Hashimoto is taking on these challenges one by one. We talk about how his island is recovering from the fires 2 years ago and the lessons learned that can be applied in other communities. He also talks about his multi-pronged approach to building more workforce housing. Finally, as if you need a reason, why you should visit Hawaii and where to get the best ice cream when you do. Enjoy. Senator Troy Hashimoto, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Thanks so much. Good to see you, and thanks for having me.
So normally I'd love to start this conversation by talking about surf and warm water and all the things that we love about Hawaii and Maui, where the community you represent. But I feel like given the disasters we are seeing on the East Coast in Texas and the disaster that hit your island just 2 years ago, I think a good place to start is frankly with the recovery, response, lessons learned, and what all of us who will be inevitably facing these extreme weather events, what we can learn from your experience.
Yeah, I think it was coming up on, a few years from the tragic accident, it happened in August. So, it's that the anniversary milestone is coming up. And so we always think about that tragic day that happened. I think no one knew back then that what a red flag warning was. And so I think, a lot of folks who live in drier areas and high wind areas, they really know what that is. But I think that just shows how much of we let our guard down, right? I think people always think that it's not going to happen in my community. We will always be safe until it does, right? And so I think that's the thing that people all across the United States, you always have to be prepared, because you don't know what Mother Nature is going to bring in, what kind of conditions are going to permeate to wreak havoc on a community. And so, I think during that time, we had a very difficult time managing through the fire. Post-fire, Maui is a little bit more remote than somewhere like Oahu, where at least you have the military that could have came in and assisted, but you couldn't do any helicopters at that time because the wind was so high. And so that's why you saw that much devastation happening. It was just bad weather, bad confluence of events. And since that time, I think we've been in rebuild mode. I think we've been working very closely with our partners at FEMA. I think one of the biggest things that I was working on was the housing aspect. I think, our governor took charge and he actually put folks in hotel rooms, and we were paying a tremendous amount every single night. And so when we look back at, was that action the right one? I think we always debate if that was the right thing. But I think at the time we were like, we wanted, get people into shelter. We had, thousands of people who just didn't have places to live. And so that was something that we decided we needed to do. And that continues to be a perpetual problem. I think if you ever come and visit Hawaii, it's very expensive. And so cost of living is a huge driver in a lot of what we do. And so I think housing is something that we're trying to figure out, both temporary housing and the long-term permanent housing. And if you come and visit today, the town is slowly rebuilding. It won't get back to what you iconically have known Lahaina to be for many, many years. I think we're about to reopen the Lahaina Harbor, where you probably launched off to go on your dinner cruise or go snorkeling. But that's like the first big reopening of the town, and then hopefully some of the shops will then start to rebuild. It has been slow. There's been a lot of debate, and there's still, I think, people who are unhappy with what the plan needs to be. But I think it shows that we really have to think through, and you have to be resilient during these times. But you have to keep moving forward and trying to figure out what are the things that a community really needs to sustain themselves once again.
And unfortunately, I think given climate change and the way that it's driving weather patterns, these natural disasters will be more and more inevitable. How do you prepare for the next disaster when you're trying to deal? You had a housing crisis, then you had this crisis layered on top, and now, but you still have to prepare for the next weather event and the next one. And certainly being an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you're more vulnerable than most. So how do you build resilience and response for the next disaster as you're trying to recover from the first one?
And you would think that would be a really straightforward answer, but over the last, since the disaster, it actually has been a very difficult conversation. So I think, right after the disaster, the conversations revolved around, do we want to rebuild fast? Or do you want to rebuild better? And I think I remember that my partners at the county telling me, unfortunately, we can't do both. I said, well, I think we got to rebuild better, because I think there is a reality at some point that we don't want this to happen again. So I think they've been trying to straddle that line of where you want to head after disaster. I think, they did get some, we do have about 400 temporary structures of housing for those who did not have a place to go after the fire, and I think that will continue to persist. Interestingly enough, in Lahaina, that disaster is very unique because 90%, according to FEMA data, were renters, right? So the vast majority of people are technically more transient, and so you have to somehow get people who don't necessarily live in that house to rebuild that house. But I think in the rebuilding process, what we've been trying to, number one, do is get them to build up to current building code standards, because I think a lot of the homes were very old. I think 50, 60 years old were at old building code standards. I think that's number one. And why that's really important is because I think you take a look all across the country, and not every state is experiencing this, but I know the state of California is in the same boat. The state of Florida is in the same boat. It's just insurance rates are skyrocketing right now. And it's becoming unaffordable because insurance companies don't want these high risk areas. So Hawaii, unfortunately, is kind of falling into that category, partly because of the fires, but partly because of our hurricane risk, partly because, sometimes we can even get flooding in Hawaii in some areas. And so there's risk involved. And so they're pushing up rates. It's a confluence of events of a lot of things happening all at once. But that gives you even more incentive to build back better, because you want to somehow bring those insurance rates down. But they're not going to look at every individual structure when they structure insurance rates. They're looking at regional upgrades, right? So I think we as a state and county really had to take a look. Number one, are we going to underground some of the power lines that we had throughout the community? But when we looked at how much money it would cost to underground a lot of the power lines throughout the Lahaina, I think it was in the billions of dollars. And obviously we don't have that resource to do that. So I think you have to strategically figure out what are the most vulnerable areas throughout the town that we can underground. And so we're still working through that. That's really important. And then, of course, the evacuation routes, right? A lot of the area of Lahaina was very historic. It was built out of the whaling days. The harbor was the point where a lot of people would traverse. And so you're moving out from that, and a lot of the streets were narrow. And so now we're unfortunately having to ask people, okay, you might have to give up your home. Just a little bit of your what you used to be of your house, so that we could widen the roadways. But when a disaster happens, we have to be able to escape in a timely manner, and that was really a tough thing to do during the disaster. So I think it's thinking about all of those regional upgrades and making sure that you can implement, because in theory, this is the easiest time that you're going to have. If you wait, the longer you wait, the harder it is going to be to implement some of those safety measures. And I know for a lot of communities out there, it's tough because everyone's thinking the status quo is fine. but you want to think about disaster proofing your communities, and people will just say, well, if I have to pay for it, absolutely not. And that's the push and pull I think that we're all going to face throughout the communities. But the disasters are getting stronger, and so I think we're all going to have to think twice, because you're going to have to we kind of have to either think, are we going to pay now, or we're going to pay tremendously later.
And you came from local government, you've now in leadership at the state level. Obviously, the federal government has a role to play, and hopefully they'll continue to play that role. Seems unclear right now.
Right.
How do you, what's the recommendation for those who are just emerging from these disasters about how to coordinate across these governmental levels?
Yeah, I think I would like to say we figured it out in Hawaii, but it's still tough, right? And I think Hawaii is a more simplified form of government. We have a county, state, and the federal, right? I think I look at places in California, and I'm like, I get super confused. You have a city, you have a county, you have everyone, so many elected officials, right? But even in our simplified form of government, I think the problem was that the mayor, in theory, of the county, it's a city county, a joint kind of thing, is supposed to take the leadership in the disaster recovery. But I think at some points of the disaster recovery, people felt he was moving too slow. So I think the state would start to step in and take point. But I think looking back, and it's still persisting now, is now we have this push and pull of, okay, well, I thought you're going to take that on. So, for example, I think the county essentially told us at the state level, you take on the housing, of the temporary housing for the community. But as a result, they kind of took that off their plate, and now they're not thinking about the housing continuum. And I think there's some overlap. And I think, because we're providing more temporary housing on a really good price basis, now that the county's building permanent housing, and they said they would take that on, people don't want to move out of the temporary housing to the permanent housing, because the temporary housing, of course, was way less expensive. And so that continuum, there's a gap there. But I think part of it is you have to figure out how to get over some of those differences, and you have to be able to have those frank conversations. And I think in these disasters, a lot of people want to be the front person, right? They look at it as like, well, I'm the leader. But I think at a certain point, you have to put your egos aside. And I think in this case, I have to give our mayor a lot of credit, because he was the one kind of said, well, Gov, if you want to take that on, you go do it. And he played a little bit more of a passive role. But I think that you got to know when to push, when to pull, when to get federal resources. And I think I do want to make a point, because you did make a point of, will the federal government play a role? And I think they have to play a role. I don't think we could get out of what we experienced without the help of the federal government. They tremendously pumped a lot of resources into Lahaina and the other fire area on Maui, upcountry Maui. And they have been coordinating a lot of the disaster relief. And, without that, I'm not sure we would be in the same place that we are.
You mentioned that housing before the disaster was a crisis. And you've been taking some serious initiatives to address that. This is not easy anywhere. I imagine it's especially not easy in Hawaii, where people move there because they love the natural beauty. They want to be a little bit away from the crowds already. Talk about your efforts to try to address the housing crisis on the islands.
Yeah. So when you take a look at where your paycheck goes, every single month, when you break it down, obviously in most cases, most of your money is going to your housing costs. And so when we take a look at that, when we want to say, well, affordability is the biggest issue that our constituents are facing, well, the best way is, if you can figure out partly to bring down that housing cost, you're going to automatically take care of that affordability issue, because then you'll have more money to spend on a whole lot of other things. Obviously, in an island situation where land is so scarce, I think that is what is really the main factor is, we're not allowing a lot of building to occur. And when you add the cost of, you add on tariffs, you add on shipping costs, you add all the expenses that you normally would get all across the United States, but then you add that compounding effect, having to get things to Hawaii. Housing is just very, very expensive. I think it's a very desirable place to live, so the demand's very, very high. And so, we're forced to really take a look at very creative solutions. And so I think there's a continuum of things that we're trying to experiment with. I think one of the big things that, one of the big bills that we passed this past session was, I think there's a premise of we have to be able to utilize government property to build affordable housing and somehow be able to leverage that. So if you can get the acquisition costs out of the way, then maybe it will help private developers to bring down the cost of housing. And so we passed a lot of interesting bills. Like one of them is we're going to do a government housing program where we will allow government workers. We're going to create housing specifically for government workers. So we're going to see if we can make that work. And so, it'll be incentive because number one, we really have a hard time recruiting people to work for government these days. And if we can take care of a part of their housing, I think that would be a win for us. So I think we're looking at teachers, we're looking at just rank and file, hard to staff people. And if we can provide housing, I think that would be a very interesting concept to prove. I think the other thing that we're really taking a look at is how do can we, because anytime we own a piece of property, we don't necessarily want to sell that off, but we were thinking maybe we can go back to a leasehold model, right? So we build an apartment building, we can sell that apartment, but we keep the leasehold on the property. So we're looking at 99-year leaseholds to try and see, okay, will that create a secondary market for ownership where it's the leasehold market, and will that possibly bring down the price just a little bit because it's not a fee simple. You don't own the unit outright. We wouldn't necessarily charge a leasehold rent every single month. We keep it very, very affordable, but we're testing that concept to see if we can make a different tier of product type that might be something that people can purchase, right? Because I think part of it is we have the low-income housing tax credit projects, which is 60% of the area median income and below, which is, it's fairly low. I think that the gap that we have is the working class, which is workforce development, like teachers, police, firemen, and we typically categorize that between 60 to 120%. And of course, I think the rest of it is 120, typically to 140% of the area median income. But we're really trying to figure out how do we get more housing in that, 60 to 120% area median income. And so those are the type of projects that we're trying to push. Concurrently in Hawaii, we have a very, very unique setup because we actually have when we became a state, we under the condition of statehood, Congress allows us to discriminate based on race. And so we have a huge system for Native Hawaiian housing, right? And so it's supposed to be reparations for all the things that they went through, during the time of, as things changed throughout Hawaii. And so we actually have a department that builds, if you're 50% Native Hawaiian, we actually will be able to lease you land for 99 years. So we've been pumping a lot of money into that program to make sure that there's enough housing to meet their demand, because at least that will be stay and affordability in perpetuity. And so that's another way we can get people onto houses that they practically own for 99 years. It's a very, very long time. And so that's something that we're taking a look at to see if we can do. The wait list is extremely long. There's a lot of people that qualify, but we haven't been able to keep up. And so we're trying to change that dynamic with them, so that we can at least get those people out of our regular housing stock into that special stock. So I think that I guess the theme here is we're trying to create sub-markets to the regular market to see what will happen. And when we know Hawaiian Homes is a tried and true program. It's just we haven't been doing a good job, but we were trying to create within the open market some sub-markets, and we'll see how that works.
Fascinating. I didn't know that. What percentage of the population would qualify for that housing?
Well, because the blood quantum is 50%, it's getting less and less. That's a good question of what percentage, but it's not a large percentage of the population. But you can pass down that property to the next generation as long as they are 25%. And so obviously the population gets smaller and smaller, because to keep that blood quantum is very difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think it's a very important part of the housing stock, and to kind of take care of that population.
Can you talk about the bill that you championed around land exchanges? I thought this was a really interesting idea to create more opportunity for developing, but then also preserve agricultural and other valuable lands.
Yeah, so I think that was something that we were thinking about with some of the larger landowners, to see if we can exchange some properties that they have within some areas that are a little bit more desirable. And so if we could exchange properties with them, we keep the ag land in ag land, because a lot of property, a lot of people own a lot of ag land, and in exchange we get, just keep that in ag land, and then, you give them value in something else that they might have, especially because I think what we're really focusing on is the transit-oriented development area. And so I think if we could get that high value area, you keep the development in a specific area where you can do density, and to ensure that number one, they get value, and number two, that we get the type of development that we really want. And so I think that was something that will affect my community on a neighbor island, because then at least, these companies can really think twice before, selling something off because they need money. But if we can exchange something, for them for value, and then get some type of development, and then they don't have to worry, because they have the development right somewhere else. I think it's something that we're looking at. It's kind of going to be a pilot to see if how many landowners are interested in this, and number two, can we actually make it work? So in concept, I think it was something that we thought might be interesting, but in practice, you have to really make it happen. And so I think a lot of these bills that we're doing that's the concept. We think of a concept, but in practice, sometimes it gets a little bit more difficult, because there's a lot of elements that you don't really think of sometimes when you're drafting the legislation.
Can you talk about how you found yourself in this position of trying to figure out how to create submarkets and housing for different populations? What was your path to public service?
Yeah, so I think if I look back originally, how did I get into this area of elected office? I was kind of lucky, because I fell into it when I was actually in high school. I was kind of like a student council nerd, and I would. It's kind of interesting though. In high school, they have this whole student council network, and in the state of Hawaii, it kind of culminates where, they actually have an elected position at the time. They no longer do this, but at the time you had one student representative on the State Board of Education, and you'd have to get elected by your peers. Because I was in, that network, I was like, oh, I'm going to go run for that, just see how you do. And, miraculously, I won. And so I spent my whole senior year at that time traveling across the state, and going to these Board of Education meetings. And at that time, all the members were elected. I think subsequently, about 5 years after that, there was a referendum on as a constitutional amendment to make them appointed board. So it's no longer as fun. But that was the time when I was on it. That's when all the politicians would run for the Board of Education to get their start in politics. So, I think during that year, you kind of meet these very interesting characters, and you kind of start to learn that you're like, oh, okay, they're regular people. They're not, they're very interesting, but they're not necessarily out of the ordinary. And you're like, okay, they're very personable, approachable. Their solutions aren't like profound. They're just like regular solutions. And so I think it gave me some confidence that I'm like, okay, well, if they can do it, maybe I can do it, right? And so I always kept that in my mind. And but I think that what they instilled in me is you have to just stay involved no matter what it is. And so I went on to college after that year. You kind of I stayed involved in college, but. And then after college, I went off to the U.S. mainland. I went to school in Colorado. But I spent 5 years there getting my master's. I got my undergrad and master's there, and then I decided to come back home because, we had a family friend who was running for re-election for a mayoral campaign. So I thought I was just going to come back for a summer to help on the campaign, and that turned into a little bit of a longer gig, and then I went unfortunately, that for that race, it was kind of sad because they lost the re-election. So I know what it means to lose, even though you work really hard. But I think at that time, when one door closes, you never know what door will open. And right after that loss, I think one of the county council members were looking for staff, and so I joined the staff of the Maui County Council, and I served as staffer for almost 7 years before getting appointed to the state house. And so, very interesting journey. I think my time at the county was very good because that is what it taught me about a lot of land use stuff, right? Because I think at the end of the day, a lot of times the states rely on the counties to do land use policy. Like we do broad strokes in terms of what we want out of the counties and the cities, but that's where the action happens in land use policy. And so I think for me to be able to understand a lot of the internal what the counties are thinking and take that to the state, I think that's what makes it a lot about very valuable. So you'll look, actually all the housing committee folks in our circle, both on the House and Senate, we're all from the county. We originated from the county because I think we understand that there's an interplay there, and you got to kind of understand once you set a state policy how it's going to get implemented. And so I think that interplay is very, very important. I think a lot of the state folks, if you don't have that county interaction, that's what you got to do to really make good policy. Because at the end, if you pass good, policy, but people don't implement it, then you've kind of failed, right? Sometimes, and so that's the journey, the pathway. I think I've been very, very lucky along the way because I'm actually a double appointee, so I haven't had to run for my seat. Right after the Lahaina fires, my senator decided to pursue fire cases as an attorney, so he decided to resign from the Senate, and I got appointed by Governor Green to the Senate, and I've been there for 2 years. But sometimes you're never that lucky, but someplace you got to be at the right place at the right time, and you gotta know, you gotta establish relationships because you never know when those relationships may come in handy.
Yeah, so you have to have laid the groundwork, and you certainly have lots of experience in public service. You've also, in both the House and the Senate, you've also had a leadership role, and within the caucus. Can you talk about? I mean, I think we interview a lot of folks who are Democrats in red states or purple states. Hawaii is a solid blue state, but that doesn't make holding governance caucuses together easy. Can you talk about some of the challenges of being in leadership when you're in this of the state legislative body, even when it's a solidly Democratic one?
That is a really good question, and I think people are like, "Oh, you're such a solidly blue state. You should be able to pass all kinds of legislation." Unfortunately, that's not the case. I think at least, when I look at the states that have a split amongst parties, at least I actually sometimes envy them because at least where people stand based on your party label, right? And I think the challenge with us in Hawaii is that because we're just predominantly Democratic state, you just don't know what shade of blue you are, because there are different shades of blue. Right, and it's just a matter now of you got to know every single person on where they stand, and also on every issue. But you can just never get that. You can never get them based on their label, and so it makes it a little bit more difficult. So so I think it becomes okay. We know certain senators are the more conservative senators or the more liberal Democrats, right? And so I think that you kind of have to play it a different way. Whether that's a good thing or bad thing, I'm not sure. And in theory, you're supposed to be really good friends with the same party governor, right? But our governor is typically always Democrat, and so we're always straddling that fine line of a lot of times it becomes personality, and I don't know if that's a good thing when it's personality. I think because Governor Ige he was the governor during the pandemic. I think that the relationship was very tenuous because I think a lot of people felt that he was moving too slow during the pandemic. And then of course with Governor Green, he moves way too fast, and so people are like, oh my gosh, what do we do with him now? But I think Governor Green, because he moves really fast, he tries to reach out a lot of times, and so I think he's been able to keep that relationship fairly strong. But in typical times, if it's a Democratic legislature, Democratic governor, you're all on the same page. But we actually have to work very, very hard at it. It's not something that comes naturally, and we have to be very, very intentional. And so, I think it's like anything else. You look at other places, the grass is never greener on the other side. The grass is green where you actually water it. So you have to always work at things, even if you think that things are problematic in your state. I think every state has its own unique problems, but I think part of it is just figuring that out, right? And figuring out ways to make your state a better place. I think oftentimes, I have a group of senators that I always talk with, and we always say, okay, yes, the politics is hard, but will our decisions better Hawaii, right? We have to put the politics aside, and we have to look at the bigger picture. And I think we have to constantly remind ourselves that, because sometimes we're mad at our House colleagues and we want to kill their bills. But if it's a really good bill that's going to move the state forward, we have to keep that focus. And so, yeah, very, very interesting dynamics. I think keeping everyone in line is tough sometimes. And I was telling folks, I think at the New Deal conference that or forum, that sometimes fellow Democrats, they use our small minority caucus of Republicans against their own Democratic caucus, which is very, very interesting, right? So there is some bipartisanship sometimes.
Goes to show nothing's ever easy. It's if you think it, you got to envision that you get to a certain number, it's all going to be just everyone goes in and check the boxes, but it just somehow never works out that way. You mentioned COVID, and it just strikes me that obviously COVID impacted the whole world, but in a tourism-based economy, COVID had a profound impact on Hawaii. And then you've now as we emerge post-COVID, and then you've had fires, and now you have a president that is really discouraging and driving down foreign tourism. How give me the last couple of years in Hawaii, and how are things going, and what do you foresee for the future, to the extent you can tell?
Yeah, these past few, I guess 5 years, I should say, have been very, very difficult for Hawaii. So when we take a look at visitor statistics, visitors are the biggest source of our economy, right? We rely on them very heavily. A lot of times we're looking at pre-pandemic numbers and pre-fire numbers. And so those are the two milestones and the two blips that we've had throughout the last 5 years. And we're still reeling. We have not recovered from pre-pandemic. I think some areas of the state have recovered from post-fire. Maui has not recovered from either, my hometown. And so I think that is a very big concern. And I think we've been managing, because we do have a lot of, we have different sources of revenue for the state, right? So we do still have to charge income tax, and so that's a big source of revenue. But then general excise tax by far is, we tax every single good. It's broad-based, low rate, broad-based, and so that's not like a sales tax, but that keeps us going. When visitors come and they consume more, of course, we get more money. And we've actually increased over the last couple of years our visitor accommodations tax. The downside is the visitor accommodations tax is about 15% now. So anytime you rent a hotel, or staying at a hotel in Hawaii, you're paying 15% of the transit accommodations tax, plus another 4.5% on general excise tax. So you're getting taxed approximately 20% for your stay per night. So it is very expensive to come to Hawaii. But as a result, because we've been increasing some of these taxes, we've been able to stay solvent. So looking to the future, especially with what we've seen with the federal government and people, especially from places like Canada, which at least for Maui is a big source of visitors, they're kind of saying, maybe not America, or not Hawaii. Number one, because of the cost. Number two, because of just the dynamics of what they feel. But nevertheless, it's just showing that tourism has slowed down tremendously. I think the other place that Hawaii really relies on tourism is from Japan. And because of the weekend, everyone from the United States is going to Japan, and they're flooding Japan, but none of them are coming here, which they would typically do, and coming to Hawaii, which they would typically do. So that has tremendously impacted our market. And so I think moving forward, this uncertain tourism economy plus the uncertainty of the federal government's resources, I think we're very, very concerned about what we're going to do within the next couple of fiscal years. And so I think we had to make some tough decisions this past year on balancing our budget, but we do know that next year likely will be a little bit tougher, right? Because I think we're finally realizing some of the impacts that the federal government will have. I think we do know that healthcare will be a big sector that we're going to have to figure out. Some of the education funding is really difficult, and so I think we know hard choices will likely need to happen. And so I think we've been trying to save as much as we can during the good years, but I think it's going to be a balancing act for us. And I think we're trying to brace ourselves. I think a lot of members are kind of not happy because it's obviously an election year next year, and they do want to deliver for their communities. But I think we're going to have to make some tough decisions. I think this past year we were trying to eliminate some tax credits that historically we've been giving out, but maybe it's time to move on or reevaluate them to generate some revenue. I think we've been trying to also, for years, trying to diversify our economy, but it's not as easy as you think to move from a tourism-based economy to something else. I think we've tried it all, from agriculture to high-tech industry. Obviously tourism is just our best commodity that we have. But it's about continuing to think, right? I think everything's on the table, but we do have to keep working at it, and I think it's going to take a lot of time.
I got to end on a good note, on a high note. Somebody decides they need to spend, especially as things get colder, a vacation on your island in Maui. What do they have to do? Give me the 3 things that will make their trip memorable.
Yeah, well, first off, we want you to come to Maui. So if you're hesitating or you're on the fence, you need to come, right? I think it'll be well worth it. The experience is great. The natural beauty is wonderful. I think if you had to distill it into 3 things, I think the top thing that everyone loves to do is they want to go and watch the sunrise on Haleakala. That it is a tremendous experience. I don't necessarily do it all the time because you have to wake up super early and drive up that mountain, but it is worth it once you see it. I think you need to go and go to try out one of our many very beautiful beaches. I think whether you're snorkeling or you're just going to lay out on the beach, it's a must do it. That's the top thing. And then the third one, I want to shout out my constituents who own this shop called Tasaka Guri Guri. And it's this delicious, soft type of ice cream that you kind of eat. I guess that's how I would explain it, but it's very unique. You got to go try out their shop. And it's right in my district of Kahului. If you come on a cruise ship, it's right at the shopping center, right across the street, but Tasaka Guri Guri.
All right, sold. Beaches, ice cream, sunrises. Doesn't get any better than that. Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks for being a part of New Deal. And we look forward to hearing how some of these innovations that you're working on, especially for this middle income folks trying to make housing more affordable. I think it's something that impacts so many communities, and we'll be looking to you to see if we can steal some of those ideas and help the working families in our communities as well.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at New Deal for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.